Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are on the planet. Welcome to this Galactic Collaboration Summit presentation. This one is all about stages and state machines. They are, by far, the best way to model and manage workflows. My name is Mike Fitzmaurice. I'm the Chief Evangelist at WebCon. That's how you spell my name. That's how you pronounce it, Fitzmaurice. My preferred pronouns are he and him. You can reach me at mikefitz@mikefitz.com or at mikefitz@webcon.com. Claim to fame, I'm the original SharePoint evangelist. Long before it was actually called SharePoint, it was my job to knock on doors and get IT professionals and developers to take a look at a new platform that would eventually take over the world, and happily so. I was involved with Microsoft for 11 years. Most of the time spent on SharePoint, a little bit working with Exchange, also doing workflow-related stuff. I've spent 10 years at another workflow company, and for the last 2 years, I've been the chief evangelist at WebCon, yet another workflow company, and a really, really good one. I've been doing workflow in one form or another for 25 years. That includes business process management, low-code, no-code, citizen development. I've been at this for a long time. Today's agenda is all about not so much using any particular workflow tool, but how to think about workflow as you use your tool of choice. By analogy, think about this less as a session about how to use Microsoft Word and a lot more about how to write well. This advice should apply to a great many different kinds of tools, and it's based on a lot of repeated experiences and a lot of repeated observations going back years, going across industries and company sizes and locations and everything. So let's get to it. Sequential workflows, and by that I mean workflows that move in a straight line from a start to a finish point, doing some things along the way. Those get really messy really quickly. It's easier to illustrate this with an example, and we'll use a press release. Someone has to author or write a press release. It also involves the author's manager, someone who's going to check to see whether or not the authored press release actually meets the company's strategic and tactical goals. We should also get the legal department involved to make sure that we don't say anything in the press release that could get us in trouble. And then finally, we also want to include a publisher whose job it will be to broadcast this to the rest of the world. Now, if we take those and put them together in a sequential workflow process, you may think it looks something like this. We'll begin over here, and then after it gets submitted, the manager is going to have the option to approve it or reject it. And if she decides to say no, it'll end right then and there. If, on the other hand, she says yes, let's move it forward, and now it's time to have a lawyer take a look at it. And if the lawyer looks at it, well, he might say no as well, in which case, again, we end the workflow. But the lawyer could say yes, and it moves along to the publisher, whose job it is to deploy it to the public website. And then we end it. No, we don't give the publisher a choice, they just do it. Now, you may think it looks like this, but I can immediately see some issues with this. Not the least of which is, if this happens, if the manager says no and it ends, do you really think it's over? Of course it isn't. That press release is going to get picked up, examined by the author, possibly edited or radically rewritten, and then they're going to start a whole new review cycle. Now, that seems perfectly okay, except for the fact that I, as a department head, might want to know how long it takes or how many attempts it takes to get a press release authored, reviewed, and published. And I'm not going to have that information very easily if I have to scroll through 5-10 different workflows for each press release to figure out what's going on. I kind of want this to be a cradle-to-grave process. This isn't good enough. So let's start making this a bit more realistic. So perhaps this is better. Let's start, and now we'll move it along. And now again, the manager has the option to approve it or not. And if she approves it, we'll move it on to the lawyer. But now if she says no, we'll kick it back to the author. And the author now has the option to revise it. Now, if the author says no, we end the whole thing. This would be a workflow ending move and probably a career ending move as well, but it is possible, so we do need to accommodate it. In reality, we're probably going to have the author revise it and send it back along to the manager, who is now a happier camper. Moves it on to yes, and now it's the lawyer's turn to take a look at it. If the lawyer decides to say no, it again goes back to the author for revisions. If the lawyer says yes, it moves on to publishing, and again, publisher just does it. And then we end. Now, I like this a lot better. I really do. But even this is pretty simplistic. We can make this messier pretty quickly with just two things. Use your imagination and add to the diagram you just saw an extra step in between authoring and the manager review, where we have a professional editor, not someone who necessarily knows the company's goals, but someone that understands how to write and what looks good. So you have a copy editor, possibly more than that. A professional editor is going to take a look at it, and they might return it for revisions before moving it on to management. And there's also the possibility that each step could be more complicated. When the lawyer gets it, well, that lawyer may have more than two choices. It might not be just yes and no. The lawyer might say, no, revise it, I'm sending it back to the author, but it could also be not yet, I have questions, and it gets sent back to management. Or not yet, give me a moment, and they send it off to one of their colleagues. There are lots of different options that might happen here, and this diagram is ill-equipped to design for those contingencies very nicely. This is going to get really, really ugly unless we rethink the problem. So let's do exactly that. This is a diagram of stages, and I have 4 of them. Think of this as a hot potato being passed around. I've got the talking stick. I've got the press release. I am the author, and then I pass it to the manager, and the manager passes it to legal, and the legal department passes it to the publisher. In fact, the legal department might pass it back to management or pass it back to the author. In fact, why don't we get nice and explicit about this? When the manager's got it, she can pass it to legal after reviewing it, or pass it back to the author. The legal department has got 3 choices here. The author has got 2 choices here. And again, the publisher has 1 choice, just publish it. Everyone else has weighed in on this. But yes, this will work. This will work nicely. And this is actually, while being very different, much simpler to deal with. This is something we'll call a stage workflow. And in order to see benefits of stage workflows, I've come up with a list here. These are the immediate payoffs. There are some strategic payoffs, but those can wait for a bit. The first payoff is I, as the workflow designer, don't need to tell you, the participants, what to do. My job is simply to determine what is possible. When the lawyer has got the press release, what could they do? And I came up with sign off on it and send it along, or return it back to the author with requests for revisions, or send it to one of my colleagues for advice, or kick it back to the manager with questions, and so on and so forth. But I determine what's possible. The participants, the lawyer, the author, the manager, they decide which options to exercise. The path the workflow actually takes is determined by the participants, not by me. In other words, the people that are doing the work are the ones that are in charge, and this is a good thing. Every execution can take a different path if necessary, within reason, of course. And best of all, this kind of design better reflects reality. Tell me about a review situation that doesn't involve things going back and forth between management and authors a couple of times, and doesn't involve referrals back and forth. This is a better way to be. To better understand how stage-based workflows work, you need to kind of wrap your head around a concept known as a state machine. It's a computer science term. It's actually not that bad, but we're going to geek out for just 2 minutes. It's not going to be bad, I promise. There are 3 key concepts when we talk about state machines. There are states, there are events, and there are transitions. And let me give you an example that involves a table lamp with a pull chain light switch on it. We start out with the table lamp being off. And then I'm going to pull the chain. And that's going to cause a circuit to be completed, at which point the lamp is on. And if I pull the chain again, that's going to break the circuit and the lamp will be off. Pretty straightforward, and this gives you all the concepts you need. The states, that's off and on. Off and on are states. The pulling of the chain is an event that triggers transitions. Transitions are what happens as we move from one state to another. So events cause transitions between states. That's it. Don't have to geek out any more than that. There are a couple of things to keep in mind, though. The machine remains in a given state by default. I will be on forever unless an event causes me to go off. An event has to occur in order to change the state. So in this particular example, the event would be the pulling of the chain. Now, it was a very simple example. If I really wanted to flesh this out, I would also accommodate what would happen if the bulb burnt out or the lamp was unplugged. Both of those would also cause transition from on to off. And that's okay. Those are legitimate events, and we should model for them. All the work takes place during the transitions. Very little is going on during a state other than holding data at rest. A strategic benefit of stage-based modeling is easier user participation. How easy is it to have the lawyer review this? And remember, this is the simpler version of that sequential workflow. If we started adding things like the lawyer having 2 or 3 or 4 different options and there being a copy editor step to all of this, it would get nastier. The lawyer's got to review the entire thing in order to see whether or not his role in it makes sense. I can't get feedback from the lawyer or the manager or the author or the publisher without teaching everybody everything, including how to read this diagram. Let's compare that to what I would have to do to get the lawyer to tell me whether or not I've modeled their role in a stage-based model correctly. I just have to say, hey, you get a press release. What can happen? Well, I read it. And then what happens after you read it? Well, I can say it's good and then send it on to get published, or I can have problems with it and send it back to the author for changes, or I suppose I could send it back to the manager with to get some questions clarified. Sounds good. So is this good? Yeah, I like this. We're done. I don't need to go back to the legal department again. I can talk to the author separately and say, well, what happens when a press release comes back to you? Or what are your choices? Well, I can do what's asked and send it back to the manager for review, or I guess I could give up and end. And I can have similar conversations with the publisher and the manager, and then I can be done. The payoffs in the area of participation are numerous, not the least of which is I just let the users teach me what they know. That's all I have to do. The users help design my workflow by telling me their stories. Every user story is effectively a stage in the process. My job is to make sure I understand their stories and assemble them together as a set of stages with transitions between them. Neither I nor any of the participants needs to learn how to read a business process markup notation diagram. And that is a good thing. They are also very easy to adjust. Virtually everybody who operates in workflow and business process land will acknowledge that workflows need to receive regular upkeep and modifications and improvements. We're not all equally good at meeting the challenge of making those updates and improvements easy and painless and non-disruptive, but we all agree they're important. Stage-based approaches make them easy. Let's look at this process again. We have 4 stages. Let's make a little bit of room and drop in another stage. This is the one where we say we're going to have a professional editor take a look at it before passing it to management. It didn't affect the other 4 stages. With one exception, I just need to change one little thing. This transition from the author to the manager, now it needs to be from the author to the editor. That's it. That was the only change that needed to take place. The payoffs to updatability, I can do major changes with minimal disruption. That alone is great. But the second thing is, the stages are relatively independent. I can make changes within a stage that don't really affect the other stages. And that's a big payoff as well. If I had created a 4th option for the lawyer, wouldn't have affected the manager or the author or the publishing stages or the editor stage. It just would have changed the legal stage. That's exactly what we want. The only thing that changes is the transition logic. And that is a fantastic thing. The alternative is really, really unpleasant. If you don't have stages, you need to put up with ugly, hard to create, and hard to read diagrams. You have to think about every possible path in advance. And users really don't have any flexibility or say in what they do. And if users don't have that kind of flexibility, they tend to bypass your solution. Or they'll use your solution, but they'll supplement it with a lot of ad hoc email that you won't track and you won't be able to use to better understand and improve the process. It's hard to believe that one size fits all. Is there a situation where stage-based modeling isn't a good idea? No. There is nothing out there that can't be stage-based. Everything can be stage-based. I'll give you a perfect example. This is a sequential workflow using stages. It's slightly more work to create this, but yeah, I just have one possible transition and it's always moving forward, so to speak. From the author, we go forward to the manager. From the manager, we go forward to the legal department. From the legal department, we go forward to the publisher. From the publisher, we go forward to end. This workflow is only going in one sequential linear direction. However, because I designed it using stages, later on, if I decide I want the option to have the manager send it back, and I suddenly want it to move in more than one direction, it becomes really, really easy to make that change. So even sequential workflows can be modeled using stages, and that is an investment in future adaptability. Not every implementation of stages is equally good. This diagram, which is the way most sequential workflow tools work, omits details. This is super simple. I wanted it to be easy for you to follow. The real workflow process looks a lot more like this. This is where I'm being explicit about every step taking place. And yes, the diagram is going to look like this. It may be a long thing going from left to right or top to bottom. It'll take more than one screen, so I wrapped it a little bit. But generally speaking, this is closer to the way most software works if it's doing a linear process. If we flip that around and do it as a state machine, it doesn't look like this. This diagram omits a lot of detail too. It really looks a lot more like this. Some of the techniques that I've seen some Power Platform MVPs use to talk about a way to kind of make Power Automate do stage-based logic involve this kind of approach. There are a couple of third-party vendors that work this way. There isn't an actual state machine engine, but we pretend to have one by using a looping technique. So we're going to loop over and over and over again. And every time we do a trip through the loop, we check and see what the value of the current state is. And if the current state happens to be manager, we'll go down this path. And so that we goes to the manager, we assign the manager a task, they either reject it or approve it. If they reject it, we'll force a transition to author. But we're not really doing the transition here. We're just setting a variable that says the next stage we're going to change to will be author. The change won't happen until you go back through the loop and return here. And then we'll check the value and then go here. By the way, assign a task is busier than it looks. It actually involves deciding who gets the task, notifying them, waiting for their response, and then examining the result of that response. That's what's really going on. And so you repeat that here, you repeat that here, and here, and here. This is how state machine logic is implemented. It's built into a couple of products. It can be done with an explicit loop in Power Automate. Look, this is better than not having any support for stages, but stages really ought to be able to encapsulate a lot of those implementation details. There are payoffs to it. If you have real support for state machine logic inside of your platform and your tool set, it looks a little bit more like this. I have 4 major stages here. I'm in the writing stage, in the management review stage, I'm in the legal review stage, or I'm in the publishing stage. And the transitions between stages, they have names like submit, or forward, or negotiate, or reject, or publish. Technically, I suppose there is a finished stage that says it is published. And in fact, there's a second finished stage with a negative outcome called canceled. What I will say is that in a real, true stage-based engine, all the work is happening during the transitions. We'll determine who the lawyer is and then assign this to the legal department if someone chooses the forward transition. If they've chosen the reject transition path, we know who the author is already and we'll assign it back to that person. The work happens during the transitions. Now, if we want to get really fancy about things, we can separate the notion of a stage from the notion of a role. It's actually a pretty good idea. This matrix gives you an idea of what I'm talking about. You have stages across the top, the same 4 stages we've been dealing with in all of our examples, and the roles being portrayed during those stages, I've broken out along the side. So writing we think of as being handled by the author. The management review we think of as being handled by the manager. The legal review by the lawyer. Publishing by the publisher. And sure enough, the author during the writing stage is able to either submit it or withdraw it. The manager during the management review stage is able to approve it or reject it. I like this. But notice the stuff in red. because this acknowledges that during the management review stage, it's still possible for two things to happen that we don't think of as part of the normal flow of logic. It's possible for the manager to decide, you know something, I'm canceling this entirely. Or it's possible for the author to say, whoops, I know it's in the hands of management, but I need it back. I need to do something with it. Both of those ought to be supportable within our application. Same thing with the legal review step. The lawyer at this point, we're expecting to decide to approve it, reject it, or negotiate with the manager. But it's still possible for the manager to kill the whole thing. It's still possible for the author to withdraw it. Being able to recognize that different roles have different options at different stages is a really good thing, and the mark of a really good platform if it can support this kind of thing. The diagram you saw before, this is that same diagram with extra paths drawn, and they're in red to indicate that we don't think of them as part of the normal flow of logic, but they're still possible. There are ramifications when it comes to what needs to be expected from tools if you're going to do state machine style applications. One is that you're going to need a user experience that must adapt to the current stage and the current role. And this essentially means that if you're not using tools that automatically check what the current stage is and or what the current role is, you're going to need to write a lot of logic yourself. This could be Excel-like formulas. This could be JavaScript. Doesn't really matter. The point is either the platform is process aware or you are, but it needs to be done. The second thing, if you have a tool that is based around a state machine engine, it's easy to deal with this problem, but you need to know that it's there. Linear sequential engines essentially stick a bunch of instructions into a queue. The engine is constantly waiting to execute the next instruction. If it waits too long, that's considered an exception condition. For example, in Power Automate, if something runs for more than 30 days, something is considered to be wrong, and it throws an error. Well, in a true state machine engine, it will happily sit in a state forever if it needs to. It's at rest, which means if you want something to not stay in one place beyond a certain amount of time, you need to remember to add a timeout to that state. That fires a timer event once that time threshold has been reached. State machine technology is great for long-running processes. It is absolutely fantastic for it. If you were looking for something to run for years, possibly, or at least months, or at least more than 1 month, it's not a problem. This is exactly what it was designed for. Restarting a process doesn't require you to end a process and start it again, because all it really takes is a step that moves from whatever the current stage is back to the stage you think of as the first stage. Restarting is just moving from one stage to another. Audit trails become very important in state machine land because we're not following a linear path. It's possible to move backwards. It's possible to move sideways. I need an audit trail to see exactly what took place if I can move back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. State machine aware platforms don't require you to build two diagrams, one that is friendly and high level and one that is tactical and flowchart based. Usually the same process map serves double duty and is the application flow of control diagram at the same time. You don't need to do it in Visio once and then in the real tool later. Anything is possible. Here's the call to action. If possible, try to design things using stages. It is a better way to think about business process problems and business process solutions. Consider using tools and techniques that support stages. Even sequential paths can still be modeled as a set of stages. That buys you future adaptability. And finally, even if you can't build with stages, at least model with them. and use state-based diagrams to communicate with users using them. Thank you very, very much. Any questions?
Thank you for being a part of the Galactic Collaboration Summit. Join the community and meet in-person world-class Microsoft and MVP speakers this autumn in Wiesbaden, Frankfurt, Germany, with 15 full-day tutorials and over 150 Microsoft 365 and Azure sessions at the combined European Collaboration Summit and European Cloud Summit from 26 to 28 October 2020. Community rocks.